There's something in the human spirit that loves a rebuilding project. We even have a whole TV show about rebuilding projects. I've never seen this show, so I can't say anything about it. Of course, some rebuilding projects don't go as well as others. But I have a really great rebuilding story to tell you about. There's a pastor named Stephen Jackson, who is pastor of a small church in Godfrey, Illinois. It is the New Bethel African Methodist Episcopal Church. And they are rebuilding. And it's going really well. Of course, they had to rebuild because the church was arson. And while they haven't caught the arsonist and don't know exactly why, over 95% of the time when black churches are arson, which happens a lot, it is directly traced to the racism which is still alive and well in our country. But the church was arsoned, and they told, it's a small church, and they had some people wanting to help, and the pastor was leaving, but they got some help from outside too. There's an organization in San Bernardino that all they do is 2 or 3 times a year they find a black church that's been arsoned somewhere, and they come in and they help to rebuild. And this organization is mixed racially and mixed religiously and mixed every way you can think. It's just all different kinds of people who come together, and their mission and purpose is helping other groups rebuild. And so they came in and they rebuilt the church, and it was better than it ever was before. And they had the first worship service, and the mayor came, and it was a great celebration. And they came back the next week, and it was arsoned again. It was burned to the ground a second time. But they're still rebuilding. The pastor says, we don't have time for resentment, and we don't have time for hate. All we have time for is forgiveness, because we have work to do. And we are rebuilding this building so the church can continue to do the work that God has called it to do out in the community and in the world. There's something in us that loves a rebuilding story. Even as far back as the 13th century, there was a little chapel, the Chapel of San Demanio in Italy. And it had fallen into disrepair. And a young man named Francis went into the church one day, was looking around, and things were falling apart, and he saw a fresco of Christ, and he sat in front of it and began to meditate. And somewhere in that space, he understood the words to appear, Prepara la mia chiesa, which means, rebuild my church. And so, his father was wealthy, he had access to money and materials. He took that very literally and began to gather stones and do the work himself, and then quickly saw it was more work than he could do by himself, so he got his friends together, and they started helping to rebuild the church. And as they worked together, they began to pray together. And then began to worship together, and eventually began to live together. And it didn't take very long to complete the project and rebuild the building. But they understood their work was not done either. And they continued to meet and find other ways to build the church in that town, feeding the hungry and serving the poor. And while not many people remember the Chapel of San Demanio, most people have heard of the Franciscans, who for centuries have been doing good works in God's name. They built the house that ultimately is a rebuilding story. Nehemiah was someone who was born of the people of Israel, but had never lived in Jerusalem. He was a product of the exile. His family had been exiled before he was born. He lived his whole life in Persia and had made a very successful, comfortable life in that place. He was the cupbearer of the king. He had power and he had influence, but while he had never seen his home, he never forgot his home. And one day his brother came to visit and he asked, whatever happened to the people who were left behind, to the Israelites who were not sent into exile? Because while many were the poorest of the poor, they were left behind to fend for themselves. He asked about them, and the report was not good. They were living with great danger and vulnerability because the walls of the city had collapsed and the gates had been burned. They were subject to attack at any time. And this news distressed Nehemiah, and he cried over it, and then he prayed over it. And he had a conversation with God, and it's not really clear from the text whether God reminded him or whether he reminded God that God had promised that the people would come back home one day, all the people. And there needed to be a safe home for them to come back to. And somehow Nehemiah perceived that that was his calling, to leave his comfortable place behind and go to a place he'd never been to build a safe home for all those people who would someday soon return. Having worked all this out with God, he then worked it all out with the king. He asked permission to go, and the king granted it. Not only that, the king gave him money and materials and supplies. And so he goes to Jerusalem to begin the work. But he doesn't tell anyone what he's going to do, because he has to go first and see exactly the scope of the work that was before him. So he went and he did a lonely tour all around the city. He visited every gate of the city. They all had names. One was called the Valley Gate, and another was called the Dragon's Gate. And then there was one that was called the Gate of Dung, because that's where they took the garbage out every day. And I love that they included that piece of the story, because, when you're doing spiritual rebuilding work, you wade through a lot of, well, I'll just say you want your hip boots on with days like that. And so he saw what was before him, and he went to the people, and he issued them the challenge and the promise and the hope that the walls could be rebuilt. And he inspired them, and he persuaded them, and he got them all to join in and together and agree that they would work hard together for the common good. And they began to do the work. And it started to go well. They thought it was risky, and there's this great, you should go home and read the whole book. It's interesting. They started this whole thing where they have a hammer in one hand and a sword in the other hand, because they're afraid of this outside threat that would come and attack them, but that never happened. There were some threats, some challenges that held them back, but they were not external. They were internal. They came from the people themselves. Two things. And the first is that Nehemiah noticed that there were people who wanted to help, who were willing to help, but who did not have the means to help, did not have the resources, or in some cases, the personal freedom even to help. And when Nehemiah asked why this was, he learned that when everyone else had left, when the poorest of the poor were left behind, as sometimes happens in our world, the ones who had a little bit more began to take advantage of the ones who had a little bit less. And there were those who had a tiny little plot of ground to raise food, but still had to mortgage it to feed their family. And there were others who had to sell their children into servitude. And what Nehemiah realized is while there was this social injustice being practiced among the people, they couldn't go about trying to build a house or a city of God on a foundation that was unjust. They had to address the injustice first. They had to overcome that first before they ever could think about building a city of God. And somehow or other, and this is the part I wish they'd explain in more detail, he was able to do it. They overcame the injustice. Nehemiah persuaded the loan sharks to cancel the debts. And he persuaded the people who had the servants to set them free and restore the families. They reestablished justice and then went on to build the walls. The injustice was the first problem, and they solved that by overcoming it. The second problem is Nehemiah found that he had some critics, some people who did nothing but stand by the sidelines and point and laugh and mock and ridicule and be very, very loud about it. And some groups, that's all it takes, a stop action right in its place. Somebody complains, nothing else gets done. And I want to be clear, I'm not saying that any critical word is a problem or obstacle. Someone who is committed to the cause and working hard, who offers even a strong word of criticism, that can be the most valuable input of all. But that's not these people. These were the ones who never would have been happy no matter what was done. There are people like that. One of my favorite stories is when Robert Fulton first invented the steamboat. And a steamboat is a big thing. You can't just have it in the garage, out of sight, try it out, get a little test drive in the garage, so if it doesn't work, nobody knows. No, he had to put it in the river. And everyone saw it. And he didn't know if it was going to work. And the day he went out to try it for the first time, there was a whole group of people on the bank. They were just standing there saying, it'll never start, it'll never start, it'll never start. But he ignored them. And he got in the boat, and he turned it off, turned the key. What do you do with this thing? But it started.